God, that you give us to meet together. And Father, I pray as we take this time to study your word, to look at the life of Christ and different aspects of that, Father, I pray that you'd help us to have hearts and minds that are open and attentive, and Father, that are eager to learn. I pray you'd help us to see different principles contained within your word that we can take and use and apply within our lives. And Father, I ask above all that you'd be honored and glorified in all that we say and do. Whether it be with the different aspects of the ministry, Father, the different classes that will be taking place, the service to come. Father, I pray you'd be with our missionaries as they minister and serve around the world, some even at the same time. Father, I pray you'd bless there. Father, help the outreach of this church, Father, to continue on and to impact not only this community but the world in which we live. We ask in your name, amen. All right, if you have your Bibles, go to Luke chapter 7. We'll land there in just a moment or two. As we continue our study with the life of Christ, we've looked at him teaching the disciples and teaching the disciples different things. He has been up until I think we finished up last week the Sermon on the Mount and the different some of the different lessons that were there. And today we see some of his teachings as he's moving around, traveling a little bit. You can see from the title there and the subhead that we're talking about his authority over death, and we're probably familiar with that. The fact that he, in a number of instances, raised folks from the dead and gave them life. The question as we get started is, are we afraid of death? I didn't like the question, but I left it there. And it made me think of, we often attribute it to Ben Franklin. In another form, it went back further to Daniel Defoe, Robinson Crusoe guy, probably familiar with that. The whole thing, there's nothing certain in life but death and taxes, except where Jesus was around. And so it's kind of interesting with that. But the question there, are we afraid of death? Our verse, same verse, we'll have this verse. This might be the last week with that one, and a new one next week. I'd have to see where that is. But Colossians 1:16 and 17, for by him were all things created, that are in heaven and that are in earth, visible and invisible, whether they be thrones or dominions or principalities or powers. And that's interesting because we'll talk about some of that stuff today. The fact that all that is under his control. All things created by him and for him, and he is before all things, and by him all things consist. And so he is the creator, he is the sustainer. He's the one that keeps everything together. He's the one that everything has to answer to. Just by way of review, first of all, with the Sermon on the Mount, we saw Jesus was teaching his hearers. He was teaching them to refocus on the true intent of the law. It wasn't simply, hey, go do this. It was, why are you doing what you're doing? Somewhat important, like really important. And he showed them that actions are a reflection of our inner thought and attitude. Our actions, what we do, is generated by who we are, what's inside. And often we do, now this is a generic we, but often we do in order to be seen of others, when what we do should be, hey, I love God and I want to serve him. I want to please him. And then in the previous lessons we had the two gates. There's a wide gate and a narrow gate. There's a evil tree, term in the King James, or the good tree. There's the tree that produces fruit and the tree that doesn't. Then there's two types of workers, those that are working and get the well done, and those that are working and it's like, I never knew you. And so he's been talking of these things, and now we have a slight transition. So if you're in Luke, we'll start at the very beginning of the chapter, in Luke chapter 7 and verse 1. Now when he had ended all his sayings in audience of the people, so it's very probable that, okay, the Sermon on the Mount is done, now he's starting to move around some. He entered into Capernaum, and he entered and a certain centurion servant who was dear unto him was sick and ready to die. And when he heard of Jesus, he being the centurion here, he sent unto him the elders of the Jews. Now, a couple things that are interesting, and they'll pop up on the slide here in a moment, but think about that for a moment. The Roman centurion, who was he? What was his role? What did the Jews think of the Romans? And keep all that in mind as we read through these few verses here. So he sent unto him the elders of the Jews, beseeching him, Jesus, that he would come and heal his servant. And when they came to Jesus, they besought him instantly, saying that he was worthy for whom he should do this. For he loveth our nation, and he hath built us a synagogue. Again, keep in mind my statements just a moment ago. And something doesn't quite seem right here. There's actually a relationship between this Roman and the Jews. Jesus went with them, and when he was now not far from the house, the centurion sent friends to him, saying unto him, Lord, trouble not thyself, for I am not worthy that thou shouldst enter under my roof. Wherefore neither thought I myself worthy to come to thee, but say in a word, and my servant shall be healed. For I also am a man set under authority, having under me soldiers, and I say unto one, Go, and he goeth, and to another, Come, and he cometh, and to my servant, Do this, and he doeth it. When Jesus heard these things, he marveled at him, and he turned him about, and said unto the people that followed him, I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. And they that were sent, returning to the house, found the servant whole that had been sick. So there's a number of things within these few verses here that I find interesting. Okay, there's background here. First of all, this is set in Capernaum. So Capernaum, I don't expect you to be able to read all the names here. That's why we've got the big long arrow. But Capernaum's up upon the shores of Galilee. So he's up, traveling in that region up in the north. And so it's set in Capernaum. And we have the centurion, the Roman officer, with authority over 100 soldiers. So this was somebody, this was kind of, if you want to put it into parlance so we'd understand, this was kind of your low-level manager, okay? You think 100 soldiers, that's a lot. Not in light of the entire Roman army, okay? He wasn't in charge of everybody. He wasn't in charge of most everybody, but he was in charge of a good-sized group of men. And his servant was sick, nigh unto death. And I find it interesting that he sent the Jewish elders. And then he sent others, he sent friends to Jesus. Let's start with the elders. I mentioned already, that doesn't seem to fit. The Romans were there because the emperor, Caesar, said go. And they didn't really love the Jews. And the Jews didn't want the Romans there and didn't care for them at all. If you think, what were they expecting the Messiah to do? To remove the Roman rule. So that's what they... And here we have a centurion that actually not only gets along, but according to the Jewish elders, is deemed worthy of the miracle of healing his servant. So there's kind of a relationship there. Now, if you go to the book of Matthew, we're not going to go over there now, but Matthew seems to give a somewhat simplified version. He doesn't include all the detail. Think about it. Josie comes home from school, and I say, so what did you do at school? She'll tell me one thing, whatever it was. Well, is that all she did today? No. But did she do that one thing? Yes, she did. It's a very simplified version. It's the same thing. So, what did you do at work last night? We loaded boxes. Okay. Now, we may have loaded 150,000 boxes, but we loaded boxes. So I am really good at the simplified version, and some of you are as well. And Matthew, he doesn't include all the detail. Keeping in mind, Luke by trade was what? He was a physician. Details were important to him. And I mention that because there are times that some people will look and they'll say, oh, look, these two here, they don't match up. Well, the fact that they don't include all the same detail doesn't mean they don't match up. Doesn't mean they're not talking about the same situation. It's just that one was focused upon this and the other was focused upon this. And then the last, back to the story, the Jews had a high opinion of the centurion, which is interesting again, because the Jews didn't like the Romans at all, wanted them to leave, like yesterday. And yet we see that the centurion helped the Jews. He even built them a synagogue, and the Jews were grateful and thought him to be worthy. We continue on here. The centurion refers to Jesus as Lord. Keep in mind, he gives his discussion here. He says, hey, I understand authority. And you have authority, is what he's saying here. And he understands that the word of Jesus was authoritative. Hey, you can just speak the word. There's a lot that's interesting within these 10 verses. Jesus marveled at the faith of the centurion. what does he say? I haven't seen such great faith in all of Israel. Keep in mind that this was not a Jew that has grown up studying the law. This was a Roman who hadn't grown up studying about Jehovah God at all. And he recognizes this faith of the Gentile. And he heals the servant without ever going to see him. In some instances, Jesus would speak the word to the person in front of him. In some instances, such as the blind man, he takes and spits in the dirt and makes mud and puts it on his eyes, physical touch. In this case, he speaks the word to somebody who's not even in his presence, and the servant is healed. Continuing within the chapter, we'll start at verse 11 now. And it came to pass, the day after, apparently the day after the centurion servant, the day after that he went into a city called Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and much people. Just a note, you'd see this. Keep in mind the disciple, that's the follower, the one who's learning and wants to hear. This is not your 12 apostles, who are oftentimes referred to as his disciples. So there are many people following after him. He's doing great work. He's healing the sick. He is in a non-social media, non-television age. He is becoming famous within the region. And people want to see what's happening. People want to be a part of what's happening. And so he goes into the city of Nain, and many of his disciples went with him, and much people. Notice the difference between the two terms there. You've got those that are following him to learn from him, and those that are just wanting to see what's going on. And he came nigh to the gate of the city, and behold, there was a dead man carried out, the only son of his mother, and she was a widow, and much people of the city was with her. And when the Lord saw her, he had compassion on her, and he said unto her, Weep not. And he came and touched the bier, and they that bare him stood still, and he said, Young man, I say unto thee, arise. And he that was dead sat up and began to speak, and he delivered him to his mother. And there came a fear on all. Understatement of the passage right there. I mean, think about, if you're there, which is hard for us to fathom because of what's taking place. To say that there came a fear on all the people is an understatement. They glorified God, saying that a great prophet is risen up among us, and that God hath visited his people. And this rumor of him went forth through all of Judea and throughout all the region about. And so, according to Luke, this takes place the very next day. And it takes place in the city of Nain, which is not far from where Capernaum was, just a little south. It's not on the coast of Galilee, but it's up there in that region of Galilee. So it takes place in Nain, and Jesus and his disciples encounter this funeral procession. Now, it tells us that his disciples followed him and all these people. And so, in my mind, I'm thinking, okay, did the procession have to stop because of the mass of people that was coming into the city? Did the people stop when Jesus stopped? We don't know. You've got all these people coming, and Jesus at the head of the group. And it tells us here that the dead man was the only son of his widowed mother. And based upon the terms that are used here, he's under 40 and unmarried. So she's got nobody to look after her now. And in that culture, she's all alone. Think back to the story of Ruth. When Naomi's husband and sons die, the women are on their own. They've got to figure out how to survive. And that's kind of where this widow is. Now she has to figure out how to survive. From the passage that we have here, she asks nothing of Jesus. He proactively engages her. The Lord saw her, verse 13, saw her, had compassion on her, said unto her, Weep not. He came, he touched the bier. He says unto the dead, Young man, I say to thee, arise. He initiates everything. And Jesus raises the man from the dead. And in doing so, he demonstrates compassion, tells us that very clearly there in verse 13, and omnipotence. What's this? There's nothing certain but And here he shows power over one of those things that's certain. I mean, everybody, it is appointed unto men once to die, except in this case, because Jesus has power over death. And the people, first thought, doesn't tell us anything about how the widow responded. I mean, we can surmise. How do we think she responded? We see Jesus initiating the interaction here. We see in verse 15, the dead sat up, began to speak. Jesus delivers them to his mother. There came a great fear on all, so we know that. But as far as a response, the only response we see is from the mass of the people. They are stunned. They're in awe. They have this fear. They glorify God for what's taken place. We don't hear anything. In this passage, we don't hear anything from the widow. Interesting point. We'll come back to that in the application. And the people were seized with fear and glorified God. And in their minds, a great prophet has risen up among us. He's doing these great works. They still don't understand that this is far more than a prophet. Some will in time, some won't, but that's where they are. And so we have the centurion's son, we have the widow's son. Let's move over to Luke 8, toward the end of the chapter here. Luke 8 and verse 40. And it came to pass that when Jesus was returned, the people gladly received him. Now, as we continue our study, I'll bring up the first note here. The chronology is out of order, okay? We've jumped ahead a bit to stay with the topic. So the chronology is out of order. But a certain man named Jairus, when he was ruler of the synagogue, he fell down at Jesus' feet and besought him that he would come to his house, for he had one only daughter, about 12 years of age, and she lay a-dying. But as Jesus went, the people thronged him. Again, we just talked about all the people following after him. Some because they saw what was happening and wanted to be a part of it, and some because they wanted to see what was happening. And so he's got all this group of people. Now, staying with the chronology, we don't know when this takes place, but it's during the Galilee travels. Again, he was in Capernaum. He went down to Nain. This would seem to be in or near Capernaum again. When he was up in the north, that was often his, if you want to say his base, when he was up in the region of Galilee. It tells us here that Jairus was the ruler of the synagogue. The people from the synagogue, the common people, they followed after Jesus. The leaders, not so much all the time. However, he has a great need, and he knows somebody that might be able to help with that need. And so we have that part of the story, and then we have an interruption. So Jairus went and asked Jesus to heal his daughter, and Jesus was interrupted by being touched. Being touched while in the midst, what does it say here? And the people thronged him. He's touched while in the midst of this crowd. We'll stay within our local area here. Keep in mind the concept of social distancing. Try to get into a Hershey Bears game without being touched. Right? You're in this mass of people. You're being touched from all over. You're being jostled about. And yet Jesus, he is omniscient. He knows everything. And he knows that there was an intentional touch. And he stops what he's doing. And it's interesting. I don't know about your Bible, how it's laid out. Mine has the little paragraph markers to show where a new paragraph starts. And so you've got the story of Jairus, and then you've got a new paragraph in the middle of it, and then you have a new paragraph as it returns back to the story of Jairus. So you've got this paragraph here in the middle, beginning with verse 43, and a woman having an issue of blood 12 years, which had spent all her living upon physicians, neither could be healed of any, came up behind him and touched the border of his garment, and immediately her issue of blood stanched. And Jesus said, Who touched me? And when all denied, Peter and they that were with him said, Master, the multitude throng thee and press thee, and thou sayest, Who touched me? Peter said, the same thing I just did. You got all these people around you. What do you mean, who touched you? Everybody touched you. And Jesus says, No, someone hath touched me, and I perceive that virtue is gone out of me. And when the woman saw that she was not hid, now keep in mind, the woman saw she was not hid. Jesus pointed a finger and said, Who touched me? I don't know that, because if he pointed a finger, what would everybody else have done? Peter would not have said, What do you mean, who touched you? It would have been more, well, why did you touch him? However, could Jesus maybe have looked in that direction? We don't know, but he's done that before. Well, she, in this conversation, realizes that she is found out. And so she says, or she came trembling and falling down. She declared unto him before all the people for what cause she had touched him, and how that she was healed immediately. And he said unto her, Daughter, be of good comfort, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace. And so we have, Jesus perceives as he's touched that power, virtue had gone out of him, and he knew, even though he asked, he knew who had touched him. He is omniscient. He knows everything. So he knew that. And the woman, at the time of the touch, was healed. And he acknowledges that and tells her that thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace. So she's healed of her problem. While interacting, the interlude is now done, time to go back to the story of Jairus. Word comes in verse 49, while he yet spake, there cometh one from the ruler of the synagogue's house, saying, Thy daughter is dead. Trouble not the master. Again, interesting, the terminology that's used. The religious people did not often see eye to eye with Jesus, but the common people more often did. And so, don't trouble the master, not the prophet. Don't trouble the teacher. It doesn't say Lord, and it's not necessarily that they're saying don't trouble the Lord, but again, there's that idea of authority that they recognize. And so Jairus' daughter had died. At that point, how did Jairus feel? We asked a little bit ago, how did the widow feel? We don't have a lot of information. Now, Jairus is gone. He's come to Jesus, said, Please come heal my daughter. Jesus is going that direction. Jesus is stopped. We don't know for how long. Doesn't appear to be too terribly long. Probably would not have made it to the house before the message came anyhow. Regardless, if you're Jairus and Jesus has stopped his mission to deal with this, then you hear that your daughter has died, what thoughts are running through your head? Forget disappointment, or you're probably in despair at this point. Okay? You thought you had it solved, and all of a sudden, your whole world just got dumped upside down. And Jesus continues. When he heard it, he answered him, saying, Fear not, believe only, and she shall be made whole. Not a whole lot of information there. Fear not. You're telling somebody who's probably sobbing at this point. And when he came into the house, he suffered no man to go in, save Peter, James, and John, and the father, and the mother of the maiden. And all wept and bewailed her, but he said, Weep not, she is not dead, but sleepeth. And they left him to scorn. Not simply that they laughed, but again, look at the terminology. See what's there. Here the one that just a couple of verses earlier, don't trouble the master, is now being left to scorn. And he put them all out, and took her by the hand, and said, Maid, arise. Her spirit came again, she arose straightway, and he commanded to give her meat. And her parents were astonished. Again, not to be sacrilegious, but no kidding. She's dead. Astonished. But what word would you have used if you were writing the passage? They were in awe. Well, they were astonished. I mean, they were taken back. I mean, they're not expecting this. Oh, they may have faith, but is this really what you're expecting? And so Jesus continues, and he raises the girl from the dead. And so we see the centurion's servant, the widow's son, Jairus' daughter. In all three cases, Jesus shows the power that he has. And again, we go back, it is appointed unto men once to die. There have been very few instances in the entire history of mankind where one has avoided death. I think of Enoch. What does it tell us about Enoch? He walked with God. He was taken up. How about Elijah? What happened with Elijah? He was caught up in a chariot of fire. Can we think of anybody else that has avoided death? Again, very few instances, like 2 in the entire history of mankind. We think of these, we think of Lazarus. Hey, they were raised from the dead. And guess what they did again later? Jesus has power over death, something that nobody can avoid. And he demonstrates his power over that. Flip over to 1 Corinthians 15, a passage that fits with this lesson. We're not going to take time and look at the entirety of the chapter here. We'll look at one portion, beginning in verse 20. But now is Christ risen from the dead, and become the firstfruits of them that slept. For since by man came death, by man came also the resurrection of the dead. For as in Adam all die, even so in Christ all shall be made alive. But every man, but every man in his own order, Christ the firstfruits, afterwards they that are Christ that is coming. Then cometh the end, when he shall have delivered up the kingdom of God, even the Father, when he shall have put down all rule and all authority and power. For he must reign till he hath put all his enemies under his feet. The last enemy that shall be destroyed is death. For he hath put all things under his feet. But when he saith all things are put under him, it is manifest that he is expected which put all things under him. And when all things shall be subdued unto him, then shall the Son also himself be subject unto him that put all things under him, that God may be all in all. And it continues on and talks about the fact that Jesus conquered death. Flip over to verse 51. I'm not going to read through all the verses here, but beginning there, from 51 through 58, you have a passage that basically talks about victory over death. Christ was resurrected from the dead, and in so doing, defeated death. He died, he was resurrected, and he did not die again later. In his resurrection, he had victory over death. If we wanted to bring up, Pastor in his study of Revelation has Bob Shelton's timeline. If we go to the very end, what is cast into the lake of fire? Oh, death and hell. Oh, so death is defeated once and for all. And who initiated that defeat? Jesus Christ. And we're not going to take the time to go there with the thoughts here. At the end, Jesus will destroy all rule, authority, power. All enemies are put under his feet, and that includes death. Think back to our key verse from Colossians 1, 16 and 17. And it talks about the fact that he created all these things. They are all subject to him. And he will be reigning as the enemies are put under his feet. He holds all power and authority. It doesn't matter who you are and how much money you have, or who you are and how much authority and power you have. Christ is over all. He's in charge. Revelation 20, we won't turn there. is talking about the final judgment before the great white throne. He judges the dead based upon what is written in the books, and death and hell are judged and cast into the lake of fire. Notice who is the judge. He who defeated death now judges death. And as the dead are judged, so death itself is judged and cast away. Revelation 21, John's vision. Now, this will astound you. This is probably the most profound statement of the day. Revelation 21 takes place after Revelation 20. I'm sure that is amazing, but hey. So what do we have? We have a judgment, the judgment before the great white throne, and now we have this vision of John. And there's in the description a new heaven and a new earth. As though it's looking ahead toward future events. And as it's talking about the new heaven and the new earth, just some things to point out. There's no sea, quite unlike the earth in which we live today. There is a new Jerusalem. The new Jerusalem is built. It's 4 square, and it gives us the dimensions in the passage here. God dwells with man. He's not separate from, he is dwelling with. And there's no crying, no death, topic that we have today, no sorrow and no pain. All those things are put away. And so, in the end, death is judged, it's cast into the lake of fire, and when Revelation 21 takes place, there is no longer death. Well, let's look at our application. We have about 10 minutes or so. We have the lesson today. Understanding that did everybody whom Jesus encountered, were they all raised from the dead? No. Did everyone who died that Jesus encountered, were they raised from the dead? Well, no. Were those that Jesus raised from the dead given physical life everlasting from that point? Well, no, they died again. So the question is, how has this impacted our view of death? It's not as if it's, you know what, I will never die. No, I'll live forever, but unless he returns first, I will die. And yet I will live forever. Well, first of all, understand that Jesus has authority over death. And that the resurrection of the dead is real. The resurrection of the dead, however, in our biblical timeline, it takes place on down the road a bit here. But more importantly than that, understand that Jesus has real power. If we have someone who is sick, nigh unto death, can Jesus give healing? Yes. Does he have to? Is he required to give healing? Well, no. And sometimes we have to make sure that we understand that because God doesn't heal, doesn't mean God couldn't heal. I don't know the will and the intent of God in every situation. And that's a challenge sometimes. It's a challenge when life doesn't go the way I wanted, the way I expected, the way I planned. Sometimes I have to make sure I focus on the fact that Jesus still is Jesus. He still has power. Our next question. In the 4 healings that we've looked at today, Jesus commended 2 of the individuals for their faith. Another one seemed to believe, but his faith was never mentioned. And then the other, the case of the widow, there's no mention whatsoever of faith. And keep that in mind in regards to the group that we often refer to today as the faith healers. Those people who claim to have the gift of healing, you just have to demonstrate your great faith. Well, if that's the case, the widow of Nain's in trouble. Because we have 0 interaction from her side in the passage here. And it asks here, how does this, there's faith mentioned as being great faith, there's faith not mentioned, there's no mention or demonstration of faith. How does this speak to the fact that faith is a prerequisite for healing? Well, faith doesn't guarantee immediate healing, and healing doesn't require faith. Say, well, I thought God can do what he chooses, when he chooses, how he chooses, to whom he chooses. faith is great, faith is necessary, but your faith, God can heal if you have faith or not. But that doesn't mean that the fact that you have faith doesn't mean that God is going to heal. God is still God. And again, as we go through the struggles and the trials of life, there are times that our faith is shaken because we are passionate, we're praying, we desperately want, and I still have to allow God to be God. And that's easy for me to say as I'm standing here. It's harder to live as we're facing it personally, isn't it? Well, Romans 6:4 talks about Christ being raised up from the dead. And talks about being raised to walk in newness of life. We hear that at baptisms a lot. And it reiterates the fact that Jesus has authority over death. And the question here is, how does that understanding that he has that authority help us to think about our Christian walk? Well, he conquered sin and death. Now, it tells us very clearly he conquered sin and death. Question, do we ever have to struggle with sin? Is sin still around us? He conquered death. Do people still die? Well, we need to understand that we have hope of salvation and freedom from sin, and we have the hope of a life everlasting. And we come back to that in this next one here. How do we find hope in knowing that Jesus has conquered death? We have hope, and it's a biblical hope. It's not a I like car racing. Particularly, I like cars that turn left and go very fast. And so a couple weeks ago, I'm watching the Chili Bowl out in Tulsa, Oklahoma. Midget cars, little tiny cars. Well, they're not little tiny, but they're tiny cars going really fast. And I told him, I hope to get there someday. You know what's probably never going to happen? Okay. I'm a Green Bay Packers fan. I hate to say that after last week. I hope to get to a game someday. You know what's probably never going to happen? I have a hope, but it really isn't rooted in anything. But when we're talking about biblical hope, it is rooted in it, and it's not a, I hope to do that someday. It is a hope that is absolutely, positively guaranteed. And so in our English, hope really isn't the right and the best word, but it's the word that we have because it's the biblical word that's used. We have a hope of a day when death no longer has dominion. Even today, in 2022, with all of the great advances of, dare I say it, science, guess what? It is still, see, there's nothing certain but death and taxes. And we are not guaranteed 100 years. There have been reasonably famous people in the last 10 days who died without COVID, shocking though that may seem, in their 40s and 50s. They did not live a long, full life. They maybe had a full life, but it wasn't long. Death is still certain, and yet we have a hope of a day when death no longer has dominion. And that is a blessed hope. And Jesus ensures victory over death. And you have that whole passage in 1 Corinthians 15. We looked at a couple of verses, pointed out one or two thoughts from the next set of verses, but really we didn't dive into it very deeply. But you read through that passage in 1 Corinthians 15, especially the second half of the chapter, and it's a chapter that's got 58 verses. Okay, the second half is still long. But you read through the second half of that chapter, and Jesus has conquered death and kind of squashed it and scraped it off his feet. He has defeated it, and not just knocked it down, but he has utterly defeated it. And then the last question that we have, how can we take a conversation about death, which such conversations show up in life once in a while because it is appointed unto man once to die. Death is something that we all face, something that we all deal with, family and friends, ourselves personally. So how can we take such a conversation, and how do we turn that into a Jesus conversation? Well, first point that I have there is kind of given within the statement there, but a conversation about death can easily be turned into a gospel presentation. But we have to be really careful with that. Someone struggling and they're faced with or just faced death, we have to be careful how we enter into that conversation. Tact is a good thing. And in that discussion, we could talk about the inevitability of death. Everybody has to face it. And yet Jesus has promised a life after death. Jesus has promised to defeat death. Think back to the woman at the well. Jesus says, hey, I have a water I can give you and you'll never thirst again. Her immediate thought was what? I'm never going to thirst again. And his answer was, no, that's not what I'm talking about. I'm talking about spiritual thirst. Well, Jesus has power over death. Well, you know what? If I'm never going to have to die, fantastic, sign me up. And again, that's not what it's talking about. It's talking about eternal. In the passage, as we're talking to people, we can talk about the fact that we do not have to remain in bondage to sin and death. We have to fight against sin and death, but we don't have to remain in bondage to it because Christ has given us the victory. And then there's the fact, again, absolute fact, that we can be made alive in Christ. That spiritual life. We can be made alive in Him that we might live eternally with Him. We may die, but we shall live again. And if we are alive when He returns, then we may not die. And we'll live with Him. But we can be made alive in Him. So Jesus has power over death. He is omnipotent. He can do what He wants, when He wants, the way He wants, to whomever He wants. He has that power. We also had within the lesson that reminder that He is omniscient. Well, who touched me? Me. He already knew that. We saw here His compassion. The most, what I think is probably the most familiar passage of the compassion of Christ is when He's looking out over the city of Jerusalem and He says He was moved with compassion. But we see His love, His compassion for them. And He has that same compassion for us. He loves us and cares for us. He wants to see our needs met. But in the lesson today, we look at His ability to raise the dead. He has authority. What authority does He have? He has ultimate authority. He has authority over the one thing that none of us can escape. And that should be incredibly reassuring to us. Father, we thank You so much for the day and for the opportunity to study Your word.